Got late. This is Chapter 3, Scott and Lacey. Despite their heightened suspicion, the Modesto police had little to go on during the first few days of the investigation. But one thing was clear, they needed to know more about Scott and Lacey's background. Through countless interviews with friends and family, an analysis of the California Department of Justice investigators began to stitch together the victimology report that would provide a look into the lives of Scott and Lacey Peterson. Many aspects of the report have never before been disclosed. 30 years old at the time his wife vanished, Scott Peterson was born in San Diego Sharp Hospital on October 24, 1972. He was the only child of Lee and Jackie Peterson, who had married the previous year. Both of Scott's parents had children from previous relationships. When Scott was born, his father Lee already had 2 sons and a daughter from his first marriage to Mary Kamansky. Mark, Joe, and Susan lived with their mother in San Diego but visited with their dad on weekends. Jackie Peterson had 3 children from previous relationships, but she had given up 2 of them, Annie Bird and Dawn Chapman, for adoption soon after birth, and Scott didn't learn about them until he was an adult. Their fathers' identities remain unknown. One source close to the family told me that Jackie reportedly considered giving up her 3rd child, John, as she had done with the previous 2 children, when her doctor advised against it. However, Jackie raised John as a single mother, and Lee adopted John after he married Jackie. John was 6 years old when Scott was born. At the time, Lee worked for a trucking company, and Jackie had a small dress boutique. Before Scott's arrival, the family was somewhat estranged. However, the new baby became a focal point for their love and attention, and was said to have reunited the fractured family, a phrase that would be used many times in Scott's trial. Scott's half-siblings, John and Susan, would later testify about those early years. They were both thrilled to have a little brother. He was carried around so much that the family members joked about being afraid that he might not learn how to walk. Scott's childhood nickname Scooter captured his upbeat charm perfectly. Always smiling, always quiet and well-behaved, Scott apparently could do no wrong. John could think of only one incident where the boy displayed a temper. At age 4, after a light spanking by his father, Scott left the room. A moment later, he came back and punched his father in the stomach. That was the only memorable disturbance in Scott's gentle demeanor until Christmas Eve 2002. When the fair-haired boy turned 4, his family moved to Scripps Ranch, a neighborly middle-class suburb in northeast San Diego. Scott's father began a shipping and packaging business nearby, and his young brother would often accompany him on deliveries. Witness after witness described their close father-son relationship. Together they enjoyed fishing and pheasant hunting on the weekends, and from the age of 5, Scott went along with his father to the local driving range to learn golf. He practiced with a special sawed-off driver his father made for him. Lee had saved the homemade club in the basement of the family's home as a memento of those days. By age 7, Scott joined the Peterson clan of golf outings at the local country club. Yet he rarely made it to the 18th hole, opting instead to take his small fishing pole to a nearby river. Lee described Scott as happy, shiny baby who rarely cried. His own childhood hadn't been as bright as the one he gave his children. Lee's grandmother had immigrated to the United States from Lithuania, settling in Minnesota, where the family lived without running water. Just as Scott accompanied his father on deliveries, Lee had followed his mother on her housekeeping jobs. As a young man, he joined his father on his rounds repairing typewriters. Lee eventually joined the business. Lee wanted his family to enjoy a better lifestyle, and for years he had struggled financially to make it happen. The family finally turned the corner when they moved to Rancho Santa Fe. When Scott was 10, the family headed to Poway, an island city about 50,000 people, where he attended Painted Rock Middle School. He went to the University of San Diego High School, a Catholic preparatory school set high above the city overlooking the Pacific Ocean. While there, Scott honed his passions for golf. When he got his driver's license at 16, his parents awarded him with a used Peugeot sedan. Peugeot? Peugeot sedan. Police learned that Scott had at least 2 high school girlfriends. The first was Stephanie Smith, who began dating Scott when he was a senior and she was in the 10th grade. When the police interviewed Stephanie, she described how Scott had lavished her with gifts and flowers. He picked up the tab on all of their dates and even presented her with a special ring for Valentine's Day. The two had been dating for nearly 4 months when Stephanie heard rumors about a classmate named Dawn Hood. Friends were saying that Dawn had been seen driving Scott's new car and holding hands with the young man. When Stephanie confronted him about the rumors, however, she found his response hard to believe. Dawn and he had swapped cars, he said, so that she could try out his new wheels. When pressed, Scott vehemently denied that there was anything going on with Dawn. The two were just friends. Stephanie asked about the hand-holding. "I hold hands with a lot of my friends," he responded. That was the last straw, Stephanie told the police. She asked Scott to return the items she had given him and immediately called it quits. Not long after, Scott began seeing Dawn Hood exclusively. The police also located Dawn, who confirmed that she and Scott had began dating for about 8 months, beginning in the spring of 1990. They were health freaks, she said, and refrained from alcohol and drugs. She and Stephanie both described Scott as a gentleman. Dawn told investigators that she performed community service for one of their high school classes and that Scott frequently accompanied her to a facility for children with disabilities. Scott also did volunteer work at a homeless shelter as part of a school course. Dawn and Scott broke up in the fall of 1990 when Scott moved to Arizona to attend college. Dawn remembered Scott as a loner. Her family was friends with Scott while they were dating, and he sometimes stayed with her parents even though Dawn wasn't there. Dawn had never noticed any violent or strange behavior during the entire time she knew him, and she couldn't imagine that Scott had anything to do with his wife's disappearance. Scott spent one semester at Arizona State University, but he told police that he'd grown disillusioned with the school after deciding he didn't like the golf coach. The facts are probably quite different. One of his teammates was a now famous golfer, Phil Mickelson. When reporters asked him about his relationship with Scott, he couldn't really remember him because they were never in the same league. Phil was a rising star and Scott was not. It is far more likely that Scott retreated to Cuesta Junior College in San Luis Obispo when he realized that a PGA career wasn't in his future. Perched above the Pacific Ocean, halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco, San Luis Obispo welcomes thousands of tourists every year. Scenic Hearst Castle, a palace-like estate of publishing magnate William Randolph Hurst is located nearby. Scott attended the junior college for about 18 months, made the dean's list, and played for the school's golf team. He paid for school by working. According to his mother, he never asked his parents for financial assistance. He surprised both of them when he announced that he was moving out of their house to room with 2 golfing roommates. Lee Patterson told the local reporter that his son and his friends surfaced the flat roof of their new home with artificial grass. From there, they would hit the golf balls into the neighbor's cow pasture. According to his friends, Scott dated while attending school there, but he was never seriously involved with anyone. They said he liked things his own way. In 1994, Scott transferred again, this time to California Polytechnic State University, a 4-year college in San Luis Obispo. There he earned a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture. Scott's friends described him as laid-back, focused, and someone who rarely displayed emotion. While he was at Cal Poly, Scott cut back his studies, taking just 2 courses each quarter while working at a golf club and waiting tables downtown at the Pacific Cafe. There he met a young waitress named Michelle. After they'd been dating for about 18 months, Michelle told police Scott started talking about getting married. When he became jealous and overbearing, she broke off the relationship, but only after a fight. Scott did not want to take no for an answer, Michelle recalled. He would hold all his emotions in for a long time and then have an emotional breakdown. Scott cried on a number of occasions, begging her for another chance. Even after they split, Scott would come to Michelle's house, eager to woo her back, trying to rekindle their sexual friendship. Still, it was only a few weeks after Scott and Michelle split up in 1995 that he began dating Lacey Rocha. Lacey was also attending Cal Poly. Hey, Lacey. One of her friends was employed at Pacific Cafe, and Lacey would occasionally come to visit. Scott, always charming and well-mannered, caught her attention, but she asked her friend about him. Scott, in turn, had noticed the petite, curvy former cheerleader with an engaging smile. Lacey asked her friend to give Scott her phone number. When handed the slip, Scott assumed his coworker was playing a trick and tossed the paper in the trash. When he realized it wasn't a joke, he retrieved the number. From the moment she wrote the note, Lacey was confident that Scott would call her. Indeed, she'd already told her mother she'd met the man she had wanted to marry, that she'd fallen in love with Scott on sight. Sharon asked if she'd gone out with him yet, and Lacey had said no, but predicted that they'd go out together soon. This was entirely in character for Lacey, a confident young woman. She could also be headstrong and was used to getting her way. Both her mother and her sister Amy said the same thing. If Lacey put her mind to something, look out. Before long, Scott did ask her out on the deep sea fishing trip he'd mentioned to the police. Lacey became seasick, however, and the excursion ended sooner than planned. Still, the attraction between Scott and Lacey was strong, and the two continued dating. Lacey told her mother that she'd found her lifelong partner. Several weeks later, Scott invited both women to the Pacific Cafe. He greeted them politely as they entered the trendy restaurant and led them to their table, where he had specially arranged a dozen white roses at Sharon's place setting and a dozen red ones for her daughter. Scott's parents also met Lacey soon after the two had began dating. The Petersons liked the bubbly, dark-haired beauty from the start, but their other children found it surprising that Scott had picked a girl with a colorful sunflower tattoo on her left ankle. They thought it was outrageous. What Lacey didn't realize was that while all of this was going on, her new boyfriend was still pleading with his ex, Michelle, to take him back. Scott brought Lacey into the Pacific Cafe during Michelle's shift to try to make her jealous and even introduce the two women. At some point, Lacey apparently caught on and became upset, but in the end she prevailed. Michelle moved away from San Luis Obispo about 2 months after their breakup and never saw or spoke to Scott again. By Christmas 1995, Lacey had moved into Scott's apartment. Her holiday gift to him was an auburn-haired puppy they named Mackenzie. Lacey graduated from Cal Poly with the following spring with a degree in ornamental horticulture. Scott had avoided alcohol in high school while dating Dawn Hood, but with Lacey, he developed a taste for good wine. Indeed, Scott's parents told investigators when they dined with Scott and Lacey, they insisted that the younger couple pay for their own bottles because they had such expensive taste. When I started reading about the couple's earlier years, Scott's personality traits began making sense to me. A sociopath is quite capable of morphing into the very person his companion needs. It is this ability to manipulate, ultimately for selfish reasons, that is a hallmark of this behavior disorder. Just as he had with Stephanie, the health nut, he then again with Janet Ives, the vegetarian. Scott seemed to get through life by mirroring the needs of his companions. He quickly became, at least on the surface, the person Lacey wanted him to be. The rising young entrepreneur and suburban father who spent time remodeling the home, working in the yard, and joining her to entertain friends and neighbors. Later, with Amber Fry, Scott would go from a man who never attended church to one who professed in a letter from jail that he hoped to go out and to do the work of the Lord. Shortly after Scott met Lacey, he learned about his two siblings who had been given up for adoption before his birth. Don Chapman of Pennsylvania and Ann Bird of San Francisco were first reunited with each other and then with their biological mother, Jackie Peterson. As he seemingly did with every other aspect of his life, Scott took the news quite calmly and quickly developed a relationship with his additional siblings. In researching this book, I had the opportunity to sit down with Ann Bird, a bright, articulate, well-spoken woman with a highly defined sense of ethics and integrity. She seemed concerned that she might know something important to this case, and out of a need to tell the truth, as she put it, she spoke out in detail for the first time over dinner at a California restaurant. Anne came into the Peterson family in 1996 when her half-brother Don Chapman contacted her to ask whether she wanted to meet her biological father. After conducting a search on his own behalf, Don located Jackie Peterson and sent her a certified letter saying that he was her son. Jackie reportedly opened the letter in front of her family and then freaked out because no one else, including Lee, had ever heard about Don or Anne. Anne was hesitant, but eventually greenlit Jackie to contact her. She first met Scott when he rang the doorbell at Jackie's home, and she let him in. She could not stop staring at her all evening. She was thinner then, and the two looked very much alike, especially their eyes. Anne believed that Scott was immediately taken with her. She was worldly and well-traveled, having spent 7 years in London, where she attended Oxford University. She had also been to Brussels and other European cities. Experiences Scott had only wished for. Her adoptive parents were wealthy, and Anne had a lot of well-to-do friends. At 22, she had landed a great job at the Golden Door Fitness Resort and Spa in Escondido, and then later a spa in Mexico. Scott was impressed with the life Anne had lived, so much so that his sister Susan Cudillo grew envious of their relationship. Later, when Scott became a suspect, she carefully monitored everything, Anne would say, as though she were concerned that Anne might slip up and mention that they would help the police. Over time, Anne learned a great deal about Jackie and her background, but the stories her biological mother told changed continually. She recalled several different versions of Jackie's upbringing, including one Jackie later recited at Scott's trial. In that version, Scott's mother told the court that her father had been killed on December 24th, the same date that Lacey disappeared. He was struck on the head with a lead pipe for $800 in his pocket. Jackie, just 8 years old at the time. Apparently, the murder took a toll on Jackie's mother. Some of her children were sent to live with various relatives, and Jackie was placed in an orphanage. Jackie's story did include some truths, but Anne learned from the other family members that it also contained some fiction. For one thing, her father had been killed on December 23rd and not December 24th, as Jackie testified in court. There were other embellishments, but like Scott, Jackie always stayed close to the truth. There were other things about Jackie that disturbed Anne. When they first met, Scott's mother, who had a lifelong lung problems and often relied on oxygen to help her breathing, had spent some time talking to Anne about lung transplants and how hard it was to find a donor. Anne couldn't help wondering whether she was sizing her up as a potential organ donor. According to Anne, Jackie's husband was introduced to her as Pete. Only later, after the case broke, did Anne learn that Lee Peterson had started going by Pete in the wake of some money troubles in the 1980s. At the time, Lee and Jackie were reportedly living in Rancho Santa Fe. Jackie was driving a Rolls-Royce and Lee a Ferrari. They owned an expensive home that was mortgaged to the hilt. It seemed that the couple had a penchant for expensive things, whatever the cost, even if they couldn't pay for them. Eventually, Anne was told that the Petersons moved to Morro Bay, where Lee began using the name Pete. While she was already in the picture at the time of Lacey and Scott's wedding, Anne reported she wasn't invited to attend. Lacey didn't want to be upstaged on her day. Anne felt by a new member of a family everybody would want to meet. On August 9, 1997, Scott and Lacey were married at the Sycamore Mineral Springs Resort in San Luis Obispo, where Lacey would later work as a bouquet coordinator. Nestled in the lush wooded hillside of Avila Valley, the luxurious resort was a popular spot for weddings, family reunions, conferences, and retreats. The grounds were densely planted with bougainvillea, 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 and other brilliant tropical flowers, lush sycamores, and oak trees. Lacey's parents, Sharon and Ron, gave the couple about $7,000 for their wedding. Scott's parents, Jackie and Lee, contributed a similar amount, and Scott and Lacey covered the rest of expenses. The ceremony was private but well attended. It was glorious, a sunlit day, and Lacey was resplendent in a sleeveless wedding gown with a square-cut neck. She wore her dark hair in a sweep adorned with an elaborate headpiece and a flowing white veil. Their wedding day was a mix of traditional and personal. The three-tiered wedding cake was dotted with exquisite flowers, and the couple celebrated their nuptials with a champagne toast. Scott raised a glass to his new in-laws, Sharon and Ron, thanking them for their perfect daughter. Yet beneath the surface, as investigators learned, the wedding day was less than perfect. The resort's general manager, Roger Wickman, told police that before the wedding he saw Scott sitting at the bar drinking and hitting on the waitress. Whiteman described Scott's behavior as inappropriate. It also seemed strange that Scott asked a new acquaintance, Michael Richardson, to be his best man, despite his supposedly close relationship with his brothers. Scott wasn't the only one behaving badly on the night of his wedding. According to the manager, Lacey's biological father, Dennis Rocha, arrived there late and was so intoxicated that he needed help putting on his pants. Then he fell and ripped the seat of his pants. Whitman said he took the slacks, stapled them together, and helped him get dressed again. It isn't uncommon for a daughter to marry a man like her father. Scott and Dennis both drank to excess that day, and as we'll see, Scott continued to drink heavily throughout the marriage. Sharon and Dennis Rocha were married for only 7 years. They had 2 children, Brett in 1971 and Lacey 4 years later. Dennis left Sharon when Lacey was only a year old, and Lacey's relationship with her natural father was reportedly somewhat strained. The two had little contact, mostly on holidays and family events. Dennis's parents, Helen and Robert Rocha, owned a 325-acre ranch and dairy farm in Escalon, California, and as the girl Lacey spent weekends living the country life. The ranch included 4 houses, a mobile home, 4 or 5 barns, and a working dairy. The couple also owned a smaller 40-acre ranch nearby. As a younger man, Dennis had worked diligently on the farm. But after years of irresponsible behavior from Dennis, the senior Rochas drew up a trust naming Lacey's brother Brent and Dennis's sister Robin as executors of the estate. The ranch was sold in 1995, and the new owner leased a small parcel to Lacey's father, where he still lives. After Lacey's biological parents split up, Ron Gransky embraced the role of father to Lacey and Brent. Gransky had a son from a previous relationship, Daryl, who lived in Oregon with his mother. When Brent was 9, he went to live with his father in Escalon. Lacey remained in Modesto, attending Sonoma Elementary, La Loma Junior High, and Downey High School before graduating in 1993. She was extremely popular in school, joining numerous clubs and participating in sports like softball and basketball. She was also a cheerleader for our youth program. Pop Warner football. In high school, she held part-time jobs at a local market, a restaurant, and a doctor's office. In college, she worked at a flower shop and then a winery, and then she was named Outstanding Freshman of the Year at Cal Poly. Sharon Rocha described Lacey as headstrong, noting that her birth sign was Taurus, the bull. The description would be echoed by friends and neighbors after her disappearance. One girlfriend suggested Lacey wore the pants in the family, interrupting Scott when he was speaking and directing him to take out the trash in front of company. According to another friend, Lacey even followed Scott to the bathroom, where he sometimes retreated from her chatter and just kept talking at him through the door. Ron Gratsky described Lacey as outgoing, happy, and cheerful, conceded that her nickname was JJ for Jabberjaws. Speaking later, today's Katie Couric, Gratsky recalled a family trip to the caverns near Sonora. She was talking all the way up there, Ron smiled, and I said, "Lacey, do you think you could be quiet for 30 seconds? "Sure," she said. "How long is 30 seconds? Is it 30 seconds yet?" According to Gratzky, Lacey was very social and found it easy to converse with people she had just met. He and Lacey's mother agreed that she was extremely trusting, but not reckless or foolish. Gratzky's only complaint was about Scott, who felt that he did too much around the house. Ron was concerned that Sharon might be expecting the same from him. By December 2002, Lacey had made it clear that she intended to be a stay-at-home mom. She wanted a bigger house, a new car, and more children, and no one doubted that she would get it all. She was quite vivacious, but according to her sister, also bossy and eager to climb the social ladder. Lacey was a big fan of Martha Stewart, and in many ways, she worked to emulate her. She baked special birthday cakes for her friends and surprised them with elegantly wrapped gifts. She was passionate about good food and hosted dinner parties with fancy fare and expensive wines. All were welcome at the Peterson soirees as long as they followed Lacey's rules. Guests were required to dress for dinner, and tardiness was not tolerated. Everybody knew to be on time or else. Lacey wanted to be sure each and every time we are all together that we would have fun, one friend said. Lacey not only taught us proper etiquette, but how to laugh. And not just giggle, but to laugh loud and often. After she and Scott married, they briefly lived apart, with Lacey working at Prunedale and Scott going to school in Morro Bay, some 130 miles away. What seems like an innocent separation would set the stage for Scott's later infidelities. His first extramarital affair with Janet Ives would be followed by a second, serious but reportedly non-sexual relationship with another Cal Poly student, Kate Hansen. Both women dated Scott during the time he lived in San Luis Obispo. Janet Ives came forward during the investigation, but Katie Hansen's relationship was reported to police by a friend of hers. When contacted, Katie said that she had met Scott and studied together, and soon they started dating casually. On several occasions, they double dated with their roommates. Katie recalled Scott as a very bright, congenial, and courtly, and told the police he had never appeared stressed, even under intense pressures of college exams. Scott started his senior project 2 days before the due date, yet bragging that he had aced it with an A. His college transcripts confirmed the claim. Scott's overall GPA was a 3.38 when he graduated in the spring of 1998. Katie and Scott dated for about 2.5 months. Scott enjoyed dancing. He liked to go to martini bars, smoke cigars, and playing golf. The two also went on romantic hikes along the trails that crisscross the scenic coastal desert town. Scott often brought along his dog Mackenzie, the golden retriever his wife Lacey had given him on their first Christmas together. His pattern with women was solidifying. One evening, Scott confided to Katie that he aspired to become the mayor of Fillmore, a small city northwest of Los Angeles, but first he intended to travel. He also dreamed of working at the Newhall Land Farming Company, a large privately held corporation in East Ventura County. Katie never met any of Scott's family or friends outside of his 3 roommates. Until she learned of Scott's brothers and sisters on the news after Lacey disappeared, she assumed that he was an only child. Katie told the police that she had asked Scott if he had ever been engaged or married. He told her no. The following day, he called to apologize, admitting that he'd lied. He had been married in the past, but was now alone. His ex lived in Salinas. Katie had no reason to doubt him. After all, Scott lived in a house with his roommates, and he didn't wear a wedding band. She had been to his home for dinner and never once saw any women's clothing or other feminine items in Scott's room. Katie told the police that the relationship was never intimate, but she believed it was growing more serious. As graduation day neared, Katie thought the romance would continue. There was no talk of breaking up once Scott had graduated, but all that changed on graduation day. Katie was seated next to Scott during the college's closing ceremonies when suddenly a dark-haired woman walked up to him, placing a lei of flowers around his neck and planting a kiss on him that telegraphed this woman and Scott were seriously involved. Katie was bewildered as Scott calmly introduced the woman as Lacey. When Lacey walked away, Scott reacted as he had when Janet's eyes had caught him with his wife. He did not utter another word to Katie that afternoon. She didn't ask any questions. She merely counted her blessings that their relationship had gone no further, for it was obvious that Scott was still married after all. A few weeks later, Katie received 12 pink roses. Scott attached an odd message saying that he had no job, no home. Katie never contacted Scott after receiving the peculiar delivery. The picture of Scott that emerges from these episodes is fascinating. This was a man who was used to being appreciated simply for himself. He was never going to make it as a pro golfer, a rocket scientist, or a captain of industry, but he viewed himself as an exceptional citizen and expected others to do the same. He accepted things as they came, at least on the surface, but later the world would see the double life he led. One, Scott was a gentle, responsible, tolerable man, husband full of love for his spirited wife. The other, someone having reckless affairs and displaying emotional mood swings, even crying jags and his various mistresses. Nailed it. I'm okay with not knowing how to say that. He was able to lie with abandon, and no one was the wiser. At tremendously upsetting moments, he was capable of turning completely cold, dismissing the upheaval with a half-hearted, "I'm sorry." He seemed to have no empathy with those who suffered from his behavior. Roses, courtly behavior, whining and dining. At least Scott was consistent. In these and many other ways that would become clearer over time. He obviously cared a great deal about his public image. Even on a meager income of a college student, he would lavish flowers, gifts, and expensive meals on his girlfriends. All of the women, including Amber Fry, described Scott as a man who went out of his way to be special for them. They all witnessed his charm and apparent sincerity when he wanted something, but also his extraordinary callousness when things didn't go his way. Like others, Janet and Katie were wooed to the brink by Scott and then unceremoniously dropped when his game was over. Scott was a true player. He would display whatever emotion seemed appropriate at a given moment, but could drop the facade in an instant and move on with no trouble. This would be quite apparent during the press interviews in late January, interviews that would become important weapons for the prosecution at trial. He was also a phenomenal and apparently pathological liar. True story. This is very true. Most people pay a price for lying, if not externally, then internally. Not Scott Peterson. He lied again and again, often about trivial matters when it was completely unnecessary. Outside of the occasional anguish performances for a girlfriend, he showed no guilt or remorse when caught in deceptions large or small. He also perceived himself as a special case, whether dropping out of school because he didn't feel sufficiently appreciated by a golf coach or leading a blatantly promiscuous double life. Scott found countless ways to flagrantly violate social norms and to demonstrate that rules simply did not apply to him. Despite his overtly gregarious nature, Scott was actually quite a loner. Whether shallow or secretive, he remained a relative unknown to friends and associates. Few people professed to know him well. He seemed to adapt to most situations, making those around him feel comfortable, but in hindsight, he never truly let them in. He did have insecurities. Although Scott moved through several colleges, taking extra time to graduate, he made it known that he thought himself very bright. During the murder investigation, when he heard about an old college professor that had been quoted as saying Scott was kind of smart, he retorted angrily, "Kind of smart? I'm real smart." This was another characteristic that would work against Scott. As the murder investigation got underway, an inflated sense of self-worth and intelligence. There's no doubt that Scott Peterson is intelligent, but to my mind, his brash lies and flagrant conduct indicated that he truly believed that he was a match for the detectives who were investigating him. I'm certain that he expected to survive their scrutiny unscathed. About 2 months before Scott's graduation, around the Easter of 1998, Lacey moved back in with Scott. Yet I suspect that Lacey knew in her heart what was going on with Scott, especially after the episode with Janet Eyes. Yet apparently she was willing to accept it. Being from a divorced home, perhaps Lacey was desperate to avoid a failure in her own marriage. In August, Lacey took a position as a bouquet coordinator at the gardens of a villa restaurant and the Sycamore Springs Resort, where she and Scott had been married the previous year. Records indicate that she resigned after only 2 months. In an exit interview, Lacey told the general manager that she was dissatisfied with the woman who was supposed to be training her. She complained that she was constantly belittling me and was anything but respectful. She also voiced dissatisfaction with 2 other employees, saying that she had received calls with stupid questions that a little common sense should have answered. She expressed that she was offended by her $9 hourly rate, and even though she knew the salary when she accepted the position, when asked if she would stay on to train an incoming bouquet coordinator, she said no. She was reactivating her substitute teaching status on the 1st of the month. Meanwhile, Scott's parents had made him a partner in Lee's corrugated box business. Lee had proudly assumed his son would run the enterprise for years to come, but 2 years later, Scott bought out his father's share and then quickly and callously sold the company. Once again, he did what he wanted to do, regardless of the pain inflicted on those who loved him. Scott used the profits from the sales to renovate a vacant building in San Luis Obispo near the Cal Poly campus. There he opened a restaurant called The Shack, serving beer, wine, and sandwiches. Scott's father characterized The Shack as a sports bar. It seemed to be a success and was voted to be one of the best happy hour restaurants in the area. Lacey and Scott ran a business for about 2 years. Over time, however, they grew increasingly frustrated. It was difficult to find good help. The employees constantly interrupted their days off. 2 years after the shack opened its doors, Scott and Lacey opted to sell. Their relatives didn't know how much they received for it. Indeed, no one could say for sure whether the new owner had fully paid Scott. Still, he seemed relieved to be out of the business. The young couple didn't stay in San Luis Obispo much longer. After her grandmother died in 1999, Lacey wanted to move closer to her grandparents. The couple had lived with Sharon and Ron for about 2 weeks before moving to a temporary quarters on Mesquite Road. In October 2000, with a $30,000 gift from Scott's parents, they purchased the house on Covina Avenue. The pair often complained that there was little to do in Modesto. Still, they had many friends, and they kept their social calendar full, entertaining friends and family. Scott soon began making improvements to their home, adding a swimming pool and brickwork to the backyard. In early 2002, he also built a brick barbecue and retiled a bathroom, which he would later claim explained his considerable use of concrete later that year. By summertime, Scott had joined the West Coast division of Trade Corp, for whom he sold fertilizers, plant nutrients, and other agricultural products. Traveling to serve his customers kept Scott away from home at least one day each week. After Lacey's disappearance, he told the investigators that his business had lost roughly $100,000 over the past year. Documents retrieved from his office confirmed that the new division was far from profitable. Around this time, Lacey Peterson began talking more seriously about having a baby. She had been trying to get pregnant for 2 years with no luck and was beginning to wonder if it was possible. As a child, she had an 8-pound tumor removed from her lower abdomen. During the surgery, doctors had to remove one of her fallopian tubes as well. At the time, doctors told her that she may have trouble getting pregnant. Now she was losing hope. She and Scott discussed fertility tests, but before they could pursue the idea, Lacey got the news she had been waiting for. She was pregnant at last. She was overjoyed, and Scott seemed to share her feelings. Lacey's mother recalled watching Scott hurry over to Lacey's stomach when she had said the baby was kicking. He seemed excited as she was. "I assume if he didn't want to have the child, he wouldn't have allowed it to happen," Sharon told the investigators. Not everyone had the same impression. Lacey's sister-in-law, Rosemary Rocha, told the police about a conversation in the summer of 2001 regarding children and pregnancy. "I was kind of hoping for infertility," Scott told her. Although he seemed uncomfortable and hesitant around children, Rocha was heartened by the fact that Scott attended some of Lacey's medical appointments after the pregnancy was announced. Around the time Lacey discovered her pregnancy, Scott commented to Sharon that he had just turned 30 and that here he was becoming a father the same year. He thought he was having a midlife crisis. Sharon took it as a joke. Maybe it wasn't. Police subpoenaed Lacey's medical records as part of the investigation. Lacey's first visit to the Hera obstetrics? I don't know. Obstetrics, that's what I'm going with. Group in Modesto was an annual exam in June 2001. The medical records showed that she had stopped using oral contraceptives in December 2000. At this time, she had planned to get pregnant at the end of the year, the police noted. At the time of her initial appointment, the report noted that Lacey's height was 5'1" and 125 pounds. According to the records I obtained in my investigation, Lacey's pregnancy was normal. There were several notations about her excessive weight gain, but she was advised to watch her diet and increase her level of exercise. On November 6th, and again on November 8th, Lacey called the doctor's office. She said she was experiencing shortness of breath after 20 minutes of walking and was concerned. She was advised to eat first and to take walks later in the day, the record stated. Lacey was described as a social drinker, yet she apparently stopped drinking once she became pregnant. She had no known enemies and did not use illicit drugs and had no history of mental illness. A police check showed that Lacey had never been a victim of a violent crime. However, friends revealed that her high school sweetheart had pushed her once during an argument. And when the police examined her relationship further, it was apparent more violent than Lacey ever admitted. Early in the investigation, Brent Rocha would tell the police about this troubled relationship and ask them to investigate. In a twist of irony, that boyfriend, William Kent Gain, later attempted to murder another girlfriend. By the time Lacey disappeared, he was incarcerated in Washington State Prison, serving a 15-year prison term for the crime. Gain would later send heartfelt missives to a Laci Peterson tribute website professing grief and love for his former girlfriend. Even today, he reportedly keeps pictures of Lacey posted in his cell.